In the summer of 1780, British General Henry Clinton had what looked like a clean opportunity sitting in front of him. A French fleet was preparing to land thousands of troops at Newport, Rhode Island, to reinforce George Washington's struggling army, and Clinton commanded the means to crush them before they could dig in, the largest garrison in North America, backed by the full weight of the Royal Navy. He began moving troops and warships toward Newport. Within days, alarming reports reached his headquarters in New York City. Washington's army appeared to be massing dangerously close to the city itself, lightly defended now that Clinton's main force was sailing east. Clinton had no real choice. He recalled the Newport expedition and rushed everything back to defend his own headquarters. The French landed at Newport almost completely unopposed. There was no American attack coming that summer. There never had been one planned at all. Clinton had just been outmaneuvered by a network of spies operating so deep inside his own occupied city that he never learned a single one of their names. So how did a handful of farmers, merchants, and tavern keepers from a small Long Island village manage to deceive an entire occupying army for years without one of them ever being caught? To understand how the Culper ring became that effective, you have to start with what went wrong the first time Washington tried anything like it, years before Clinton ever set sail for Newport. In September of 1776, he had sent a young Connecticut schoolteacher named Nathan Hale into British-occupied New York to gather intelligence ahead of an expected attack on the city. Hale had almost no training in espionage and no real support network behind him, no courier system, no code, and no plan for actually getting whatever he learned back across enemy lines. He was captured within days and hanged without trial at the age of 21, his reported last words about regretting having only one life to give for his country becoming one of the war's most quoted moments of sacrifice. It was also, from a purely operational standpoint, a clear failure, proof that sending a single untrained volunteer into hostile territory with no communication system and no fallback plan was not a sustainable way to gather intelligence, no matter how much courage the volunteer brought to the task. Washington needed something far more durable, and by late 1778, with the war settling into a long occupation of New York City following France's entry into the conflict, he finally decided to build it properly. In November of 1778, Washington appointed a young cavalry officer named Major Benjamin Tallmadge to organize a permanent intelligence network inside British-held New York. Tallmadge had a personal connection to the stakes involved. He and Nathan Hale had been classmates together at Yale, and the failure of Hale's mission appears to have shaped how carefully he approached this new assignment from the very start. Rather than sending in outsiders with no roots in the area, Tallmadge turned to people he already trusted completely, childhood friends and neighbors from his hometown of Setauket on the north shore of Long Island, men and women whose ordinary daily lives gave them a built-in cover story no outside agent could ever match. The first recruit was Abraham Woodhull, a Setauket farmer whose family had worked the same land for generations, a quiet, unremarkable man in exactly the way a good spy needs to be. Woodhull took the code name Samuel Culper, and that name eventually attached itself to the entire network that grew up around him. He was a cautious man, by most accounts almost too cautious for the work, restricting his own trips into occupied New York City to a small handful over the course of the entire war out of genuine fear of capture and exposure. That caution nearly proved insufficient anyway. In the spring of 1779, accusations from a loyalist informant led a British officer named John Graves Simcoe to raid Woodhull's family farm directly, ransacking the property and very nearly exposing the operation before it had properly gotten started. Woodhull avoided arrest only because a sympathetic loyalist acquaintance vouched for his character, and the close call pushed him to pull back from direct fieldwork in the city entirely. He recruited someone better positioned to take on that risk going forward. That someone was Robert Townsend, brought in by Woodhull in June of 1779 under the code name Samuel Culper, Jr. Townsend was, on paper, an almost perfect cover for this kind of work. He ran a Manhattan dry goods and shipping business with his brother and cousin, which let him move through the city's coffee houses, docks, and social gatherings without raising a flicker of suspicion among men who saw him as simply another merchant going about his trade. He also wrote a society column for a loyalist newspaper published by James Rivington, who turned out to be a secret participant in the ring himself and held a stake in a coffeehouse frequented by British officers happy to talk shop with a friendly, well-connected merchant and journalist who never seemed to ask too many direct questions. Townsend simply listened, remembered, and wrote it down later, turning an evening of casual officer conversation into dated, specific intelligence on British plans and troop strength. Moving that information from Manhattan to Washington's headquarters, often more than 100 miles away through territory crawling with British patrols and loyalist informants stationed at every crossing point, required real operational discipline, the kind that left no room for shortcuts or carelessness. Townsend would pass his reports to a courier, most often a tavern keeper named Austin Rowe, whose regular supply runs into the city for liquor, dry goods, and household items, gave him a believable, entirely mundane reason to travel back and forth constantly without ever drawing a second glance from a checkpoint guard. Rowe carried the documents to Setauket, at times leaving them in a hidden box, buried in a field he rented from Woodhull, rather than risk a direct handoff that might be witnessed by the wrong person on a busy road. Woodhull would retrieve the material, add his own notes and observations gathered locally, and pass it to Caleb Brewster, a whaleboat captain who ran the most dangerous leg of the entire journey, slipping armed vessels across Long Island Sound under direct threat of British gunboats to deliver intelligence into Connecticut, where Talmadge's dragoons carried it the rest of the way north to Washington's headquarters. The Culper Ring was not the only intelligence effort working against the British occupation of New York, even if it became the most consistently effective one. A separate operative named Hercules Mulligan, a tailor whose Manhattan shop catered to wealthy New Yorkers and British officers alike, had been quietly feeding information to the American cause since before the Culper network existed, helped along by his enslaved servant Cato, who physically carried messages through the city. Mulligan's access ran through an unusual personal connection. He had once boarded a young loyalist tenant in his own home, a man named Alexander Hamilton, whom he ultimately helped convert to the revolutionary cause, and who later, as one of Washington's aides, helped bring Mulligan formally into the wider intelligence picture. These separate threads of espionage around New York illustrate just how seriously Washington had come to treat intelligence gathering by the later years of the war, a far cry from the single improvised mission that had cost Nathan Hale his life 4 years earlier. One member of the network hid in plain sight rather than behind a shop counter or a courier's saddlebag. Anna Smith Strong, a Setauket neighbor whose husband had been imprisoned by the British aboard a notorious New York prison ship, is credited in the surviving record with developing a signal using laundry hung on a clothesline, a black petticoat among the drying clothes to tell Brewster a message was ready, and a number of handkerchiefs hung beside it to indicate which cove along the shore he should land at to collect it safely, away from patrol routes. The historical sourcing on the precise details of this signal system is thinner than for most of the ring's other tradecraft, drawn largely from family tradition recorded generations later rather than contemporary written records from the period itself. But the broader picture of Strong as a trusted local contact for the ring, someone with every reason to support the cause given her husband's imprisonment, is well established in the historical record. Layered on top of the physical courier network was a system built to make any intercepted message worthless, even if it fell into the wrong hands at any point along the route. Talmadge created a code book, assigning numbers to common names, places, and military terms, drawn from a list running past 700 entries, with the number 711 standing in for Washington himself, separate codes for New York and other key locations, and substitution ciphers that could disguise individual words entirely. Even Washington's own aides who occasionally read incoming Culper reports did not necessarily know the real identities behind the numbers, reading detailed accounts of British troop strength without ever learning whose hand had actually written them. When code alone was not enough, the ring also used a chemical solution developed by James J., brother of the future Supreme Court Chief Justice John J., a so-called sympathetic stain that let messages be written invisibly between the lines of an ordinary letter and revealed only with a separate chemical treatment. Washington personally instructed his agents in its use, noting that it would also ease the fears of anyone forced to physically carry a document through enemy territory, since an intercepted letter would read as nothing more than routine correspondence about household goods or family business. The secrecy ran deeper still. Washington, by deliberate choice, did not know the true identities of most of his own spies, a decision that ran counter to his own instinct as a commander to know everything possible about the people working under him. He communicated through Talmadge, who alone held the full picture of who Culper Sr. and Culper Jr. actually were, a level of compartmentalization that meant even capturing or interrogating senior American officers would have revealed almost nothing about the network's real membership, since the knowledge simply did not exist anywhere it could be pried loose. The system was tested directly more than once, and it did not always run smoothly. In June of 1779, Talmadge himself was nearly captured while carrying sensitive correspondence, ambushed at dawn near Poundridge, New York, by British light cavalry that struck before his small escort had any real chance to react. He escaped, but lost his horse and the papers he was carrying, including a letter referencing the Culper agents by codename. The code held exactly as designed. Whoever recovered those documents on the British side had no practical way to connect the numerical references back to an actual farmer in Setauket or a merchant in Manhattan, and the network survived a near miss that could easily have ended it. The Ring's intelligence also fed into one of the most consequential discoveries of the entire war. In the summer of 1780, reporting that touched on unusual activity around the fortress at West Point contributed to a broader picture of suspicion forming around the officer commanding that post, General Benedict Arnold, whose resentment toward Congress and mounting financial troubles had quietly pushed him toward treason. When Arnold's plot to hand West Point to the British was exposed, following the capture of British Major John André carrying incriminating documents while attempting to return to his own lines, the wider intelligence apparatus Washington had built around New York helped officials piece together just how serious the betrayal actually was. André, a well-regarded officer on both sides of the conflict, was tried and hanged despite Washington's evident personal discomfort with executing him. Arnold escaped to British lines just ahead of capture and spent the rest of his life as the most reviled name in American history. The Ring's clearest strategic achievement, however, was the deception that protected the French landing at Newport. Culper, reporting in the summer of 1780, alerted Washington that General Henry Clinton was preparing to strike the newly arrived French fleet and army before it could establish itself ashore, a blow that could have badly damaged the alliance that had just transformed the war's prospects in America's favor. Washington could not match Clinton's forces directly, not with the undersupplied army he commanded that summer, so he worked instead to create the impression that an attack on lightly defended New York City was imminent the moment Clinton's main force sailed for Newport. The exact mechanics of how that impression was planted, what specific signals reached which specific British observers, are not fully documented in the surviving record, and any retelling that claims precise certainty on those details is going further than the historical evidence actually supports. What is well attested is the outcome, the same outcome that opened this story. Clinton, unwilling to risk his own headquarters while his army was at sea, recalled the Newport expedition and rushed his forces back to defend New York against an attack that never came because it had never been real. The French landed without serious opposition, preserving the alliance at a critical moment for the long-term survival of the war effort, while the British remained unaware, then and for a long time afterward, of just how directly they had been maneuvered by an enemy they still considered hopelessly outmatched. The Culper Ring operated from late 1778 until the British evacuated New York in 1783, 5 years inside hostile occupied territory, during which no member was ever definitively unmasked by the British forces they spent half a decade deceiving. Robert Townsend's identity as Culper Jr. remained hidden, even from most of his own family, for the rest of his life. It was not confirmed until the 1930s, more than a century after his death, when a historian commissioned a handwriting analysis matching Townsend's private correspondence to the coded Culper letters preserved among Washington's papers. Townsend died without ever publicly acknowledging what he had done, carrying the secret for decades after the war ended and the country he had helped save had largely forgotten his name. It is worth being direct about how this story has sometimes been told in the years since the war ended. Some popular accounts of the Culper ring, including the dramatized version of the clothesline signal system and certain specific details of the Newport deception, rest on family tradition and later retellings rather than contemporary documentation, and serious historians treat those particular details with appropriate caution, even while broadly agreeing on the network's real achievements. What is not in dispute is the documentary record itself, the surviving coded letters held in archives today, the code books themselves, and Washington's own correspondence describing how the network operated, who reported to whom, and what intelligence it actually delivered over 5 years of continuous, undetected operation in the heart of enemy territory. What the Culper ring demonstrated was something Washington had suspected since his earliest days as a young officer in the French and Indian War, that accurate, timely intelligence, properly gathered and properly used, could let a materially weaker side consistently outmaneuver an enemy with every advantage on paper, in manpower, in equipment, and in money. The British Army in New York never lacked soldiers, ships, supplies, or money. What it lacked, for 5 straight years, was any reliable picture of what its enemy actually knew, where its own weaknesses truly lay, and what its opponent's next move might genuinely be. A small group of ordinary people from a Long Island farming village, working as farmers, merchants, and tavern keepers in their daily lives, made absolutely certain that gap never closed, no matter how hard British intelligence officers tried to pry it open, and no matter how confident the men running the largest garrison in North America remained that nothing was happening right under their feet. If you found this one interesting, the subscribe button is right there.